Thank you so much for coming to do the walk around for us today. And I just wondered if I could ask you a few questions. What's the difference between a magistrate's court and a Crown Court like we're in today?
So all serious cases are dealt with in Crown Courts, and the sentencing powers of Crown Courts are vastly superior to Magistrates' Courts. But every case starts its life in the Magistrates' Court. So once a suspect is arrested and processed at the police station, they go to the Magistrates' Court, and if the case can be dealt with in the Magistrates' Court because it's the sentencing powers allow that, that's where that person will be dealt with, broadly speaking. Some cases, some types of offences can be tried in both the Crown Court and the Magistrates' Court, and a defendant might prefer to have a Crown Court trial. Lots of defendants prefer Crown Court trials to Magistrates' Court trials, and so you'll end up here. The reason for that is that there's an old adage that you want to be tried by your peers, and a jury is the people who are the people who try you, and they're from all walks of life. Mm-hmm. Whereas magistrates, the old-fashioned adage was they were middle-aged and middle-minded.
Yeah.
Middle class.
Yeah.
So not much in common with the average defendant. Whereas providing you don't have any previous convictions, anyone can be a juror.
Have you personally been affected by racial prejudice?
In my life, yes.
Yeah.
In the criminal justice system, it's much harder to say. A black person will always say they know when somebody's being funny towards them. Mm. They can feel it. So I've felt it when I've felt prejudice. Now, in a courtroom, it's not so easy to say that. There may be other reasons why another party, a judge or a prosecutor or even a co-defendant lawyer, treats you differently. You can't say it's because of race. And obviously in the modern age, no one is ever going to say anything that indicates it's a racial issue. What
was the diversity of your peers while you were studying?
So when I was at law school, that was when I did my professional exams. So I was at Guildford College of Law, and it was predominantly middle-class white people from, pretty high-end universities, and some diversity. So I was, I think, maybe one of 3 non-white people in my class, 3 or 4 non-white people, and all the classes were like that. I think that's changed a little bit, but being able to do a law degree it's a tough degree, so you need a good educational background behind you, and that generally lends itself to the public school system, which is predominantly white middle class.
Yeah,
it's more about class actually than about colour.
Okay, and in terms of your wig and gown, etc., there's a lot to sort of factor in other than educational costs, isn't there?
So once you qualify as a lawyer, if you're a barrister, I'm a solicitor advocate, but if you're a barrister, you're self-employed. And the first thing you have to buy is a wig. So this, I think I paid something like £600 for this, quite a long time ago. I think the cost is still about the same. And the gown, again, £300-400. So before you start, you're forking out £1,000. And this is for somebody who's fresh out of law school. Mm-hmm. So generally, you don't have a huge amount of income. Unless you're middle class, in which case money is not so much an issue. Yeah.
Have you had any examples of the impact of racial prejudice on your clients?
Well, I would say in a courtroom, in the modern age, the court system is far better placed than it was historically to take account of diversity, and the court system bends over backwards to try and not make race an issue. And there are sentencing guidelines which the idea is to homogenise sentences across the country. So whether you be black, white, male, female, middle class, upper class, working class, if you commit an offence, you'll be sentenced according to that structure. So that should lend itself to consistency. But the police don't have the same structure, and it's well documented that there's a disproportionate number of black people in the criminal justice system, and that's because there's a disproportionate number of black people who are arrested in the first place. So this lends itself to stop and search. So if you're black in London, you're far more likely to be stopped by the police and searched. And of course, if you've got something on you that's illegal, then you're going to be arrested. Yeah. A non-black person, white, Asian, who knows, women, may well have the same items, but they're not going to be targeted in the same way. So they get away with it. So the statistics are skewed. And of course, if you happen to be a young black male who's been stopped 5 or 6 times that week, perhaps 20 times that month, maybe more in a year, you soon get bored of being stopped and searched. And that can sometimes play out in your attitude with the police, which inevitably will result in conflict.
And on the subject of stop and search, what would be your advice to people that are perhaps stopped on the streets?
Well, the thing to remember is that the police do have a job to do, and it's not an easy job. And they have to deal with all sorts of people from different backgrounds, and sometimes they're just not very good at doing that job. So I'm not saying it's easy for people to be understanding of that, but you can try. So the police have the right to stop you, ask you for your name, where you're going, where you've come from, without any reason behind that questioning at all. But equally, you as the individual in that situation don't have to answer those questions. So you can ask the police officer, well, is this a stop and question, or is this the stop and search? And if the answer is the former, you can say, well, thank you so much, officer, but I don't think I'm going to stop and talk to you because I'm not obliged to. Now, if things escalate and the officer says, well, actually, I've got reasonable grounds to believe that you have an object on you which you shouldn't have. And the reason I have that object, I genuinely believe that, is because we've had a report of somebody matching your description, your age, wearing a jacket very similar to yours. In fact, you basically match the description of the person we're looking for. And that gives me grounds to search. And if that happens, then the police officer can search you just out of clothing, your jacket, so no intimate searches, no strips on the street. And you're obliged to cooperate in the court process. And if you don't, you can be arrested for obstruction. And so that is a very frequent occurrence. And it isn't difficult for a police officer to come up with what might sound like pretty general grounds for search. So there's a lot of drugs in the area. So that wouldn't be enough. It has to be drug taking in the area, and you match the description of somebody we believe has been dealing with drugs or purchasing drugs. So there's more than just I suspect you're guilty of something or doing something. And if you're searching, you find something, then of course, likely is you'll be arrested.
If you're witnessing a stop and search, what are your rights around stopping, recording the incident, and what do you do if you feel that you've witnessed something that wasn't right? How do you report that?
What you can't do is you can't interfere with the police doing their job, because if you do that, you're obstructing them. But there's nothing at all to prevent you from watching what's going on and filming what's going on. And in fact, we know from newsreels from around the world, and particularly America, but this country as well, that it's because people are filming what's going on that the authorities are brought to justice. And in fact, it makes the police more careful because they know that individual members of the public can record them and do record them. That's what you should do. If you see something that you think shouldn't be happening, or even if you're not sure, stop, record it, and then if you think there's a basis for doing so, you can report it to the local police station. And there's obviously a complaints procedure at the police station to deal with that.
What are your views of structural racism in the criminal justice system?
Well, it's inevitable that there will be racism in the criminal justice system. It's documented that the police are racist. That's the beginning of the criminal justice system for most people. Whether the police are racist or not is a very big question. The police are trying, I know, hard to rid themselves of that label. A lot of people will say they're not terribly effective at getting rid of that label, that they are institutionally racist, if you take the McPherson report going back to Stephen Lawrence. And moving further along the system, there is prejudice everywhere in any walk of life, and it would be naive to think that it doesn't exist in the criminal justice system. But the criminal justice system does try to remove that racism from the system by having greater numbers of non-white judges and magistrates, and of course the sentencing guidelines, which I've mentioned earlier, which should result in uniformity of sentence. But inevitably, the people will slip through those cracks.
How can we encourage more people of colour to take the similar paths in their career as you?
I think if you've got a passion to do something, you should never let anyone stop you from doing it. So there are obstacles. You may think that it's not for you because it's a mainly middle-class profession, so that's nothing to do with colour. It may be you think it's a white profession, but those are not reasons not to do something. If you have a passion, then pursue it. Even if you don't succeed at first, just keep trying. There are lots of people, well, let me say this. In my job, I meet many people who are from elevated backgrounds, rich backgrounds, with fantastic educations, who are great lawyers. But I've met just as many people from normal backgrounds, working class backgrounds, who are equally good and often better, because it's easier to relate to somebody if you come from a similar background. And so I myself am not from a particularly wealthy background. My mum was a nurse, my dad was a mechanic. It's a classic working class background. And I certainly feel I find it easier to relate to people from similar backgrounds. It's harder for people who are not from those backgrounds. You have an advantage, so use the advantage. It will make you a great lawyer.
That must be the same for your clients as well. They must be able to relate to you better than they would to someone who perhaps hasn't come from the same background.
It's reassuring for any defendant to see somebody who looks like them or is like them representing them, or even judging them. So going back 30 or 40 years, the bench judges were mainly white men from middle class backgrounds. And some of them had no idea what it was like to be a young black man. That's changing. It's not going to be overnight, but there are increased numbers of women on the bench, increased numbers of people from ethnic minorities on the bench. And that should help to allay concerns that the system isn't just.
Do you have any suggestions of how we can change society's perceptions of young black people?
How long have you got?
As long as it takes.
Look, the key is education. People need to understand more about black lives and more about black history and more about what it means to be a black person or a minority person in this country. A huge proportion of people who are non-white who came to this country came to do low-paid jobs. And so immediately they were seen as lesser by a majority of the population. And they probably felt lesser and felt they couldn't answer back. And that culture continues from generation to generation. So it's about getting people from those diverse backgrounds to accept that you do belong, we do belong here. And people who are originally from this country to accept that we're all one country and we're all working towards the same goal. And once people start to understand why it is that a young black man might feel offended or affronted because he's being picked on, once you understand that person, it's easier to not judge them quite so harshly. So it's about trying to understand where people have come from.
Okay, thank you so much for answering all my questions, and thank you again for being part of our event. We really appreciate you being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.